Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Life is uncertain. It's okay to feel stressed, anxious, worried, or frustrated. It's normal. With CalHope's free and secure mental health resources, it's easy to get the help you and your loved ones need when you need it the most. Call our warm line at 833-317-4673 or live chat at calhope.org today.
Dr. Travis Brown, what is This Medical Life all about?
This is the pursuit of knowledge as we learn about diseases from the ancient times to the present day. These are the stories of medicine.
Welcome to This Medical Life, and in this episode, Dr. Travis Brown, we're talking about medical education.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you've chosen this just to rub the salt in about how little education I need to get where I am, and you and our guest who's joining us very shortly, Dr. Tristan Rutland, how much education you've gone through.
Well, we've found ourselves both at the same point, haven't we? So, I mean, who's the fool there?
That's a really good point. Let's bring our guest in. Dr. Tristan Rutland, welcome to This Medical Life.
Thank you for having me.
And just for some background, we have you here because, well, first of all, let me just share a few things. You graduated from the University of Wollongong with distinction in 2011. In 2020, you received the Conrad Muller RCPA Outstanding Teaching Award. You've taught people at all levels in medical training, from first-year students to pathology registrars, etc. And on top of all of that, one of your passions is teaching through social media, particularly Twitter. And that's where you and I have joined at the hip, because I've spent a lot of my career on Twitter as well. So maybe I'm not feeling so diminished next to you two after all.
Look, I would like to say thank you and welcome to Tristan. Now, Tristan is a fellow lover of medical history. And so with this podcast, I put a challenge. I said to Tristan, let's go back and see if we can find the weirdest or strangest medical history or medical education stories. And I said, you know, what we'll do is, because everyone's a fan here of Twitter, we'll throw a poll online later on, and people who listen can vote and say which story they liked. I've got two. I'm not sure how many Tristan has. We'll share one each, and then maybe one later at the end. But it was a challenge to find the weirdest story. And so, Tristan, do you have one of your stories that maybe you researched?
Yeah. So I looked at a lot of different things. I wasn't quite sure what to use, but I actually went far as back as I possibly could. And I'm going to tell you, it's more sort of like a story, but more just a sort of about ancient Egyptian medical education, like 4000 BC. Just essentially what you had to do to get into medical school. I think this is what the story I'm going to say. So and obviously this is all prefaced by a lot of this stuff is cobbled together by various different papyruses and accounts. But essentially, those days.
Tristan, can I just ask, these papyruses you're using, because I know you work at Western Sydney University and Liverpool Hospital, do you still use papyruses there as well, or this is?
No, we've. I think we've moved on to the Pergamon paper, I think, as well. So that's anyway.
I'll just keep listening.
We're very much online.
Okay.
So essentially, they were priests essentially, and there was the whole idea of medicine is the priests that did medicine or get into these medical schools in inverted commas for obviously weren't they were that terminology there. They had to be of a honest and good character. They had to be very good at science, but that sort of character was very, very important. And they had to very much wear very sort of linen and not overdress. But here's the thing. So before you go into when you get into medical school, you had to have your head shaven. So you were just recognized. And I think actually from memory, this might actually be something that Assyrians might have done as well. And they also wanted people to be less talkative, funnily enough. So people that was chosen this they wanted to be less talkative. This is This is one of the criteria. Plenty of courage, great patience. And as a sign of purity, they needed to be circumcised. Also, on top of that, they needed to also have a religious education so they knew what the right way to act. Now, that was sort of interesting enough. You had to get into medical school. Now, the problem was that if you got into trouble, and this is quoting from a paper that I found as well, and I just read directly off this because I think I can't really sort of paraphrase it. Also, if any one of these students committed a dishonourable mistake that deeply affected his belonging to his supreme institute, they received severe punishment of imprisonment or either hanged. So, being a medical student in ancient Egypt sort of was jumping through a lot of hoops and the potential of, not getting expelled, but getting thrown in jail or hung. So that's my story. That's about as weird as I could find. Well, certainly for my
No, very good, very good. All right. Well, let's.
Travis Brown, what's yours?
Okay, so mine is around the 18th and 19th century. So this is when medical theories were starting to be challenged by the medical, educational institutions. So this is where ancient Greeks and then Galen's theories were starting to be challenged. And this is when, we started to learn more about anatomy and tumors and organs, pathology, surgery. But the question is, how can you learn about the body without examining and dissecting a body? And so the answer is, well, you can't. And so what did they do? Well, up until this time, bodies and dissections were that of convicted criminals and execution. They were in limited supply. And then in Britain, in 1823, they passed the 1823 Death Act, which then dramatically reduced the amount of crimes punishable by death. So a short supply became even shorter. And so as medical schools are then starting to get bigger and bigger, coming around, they needed to find supplies of bodies. And so medical schools had to become a bit creative. And this gives rise to what we call the resurrectionists, less flatteringly known as ghouls and grave robbers. And so to acquire bodies, they had to, for anatomical dissection, for education of students, doctors, and surgeons. Now, there's no refrigeration these days, so you had to go and get bodies yourself.
Well, as a student?
Well, some were janitors, some were students, some were doctors. And what they would do is they would go and dig up freshly, what would you say?
Buried.
Freshly buried bodies, because the soil was easier and softer to get to. And so some would take it on. Now, this was not liked by the general public, but politicians didn't really see it as a problem. It was seen as for the better good. The police looked the other way unless they were forced to take prosecution. So, I mean, if you can imagine you buried your, loved one, and then somehow it gets dug up. And so a whole bunch of people would actually put in things to prevent them being dug up, but it would still happen. And amazingly, the law was a little bit strange in this area. It was a bit grey because it wasn't sure who had legal standing over the corpse, because the previous owner of the body had vacated the premises. And so what had happened was no one knew who owned it. Now, so this in the legal standing. And so it was turned out that the only people who probably could sue would be the cemetery for trespass.
Oh, wow.
Right. And so but the problem was they were often in cahoots with the resurrectionists to acquire the body because it was money. And so you get a whole bunch of pretty much medical schools and doctors getting to these bodies and digging them up for an anatomical dissection, so that because you go into an anatomical lab, we're used to seeing specimens, but they didn't have preserved specimens back then. So how do you learn surgery? You learn on recently dead bodies. But it gets a little bit of a twist, of a sinister. So if you're in the business of acquiring bodies, some entrepreneurial people will start to potentially maybe even hasten the experience. And so what happened was you get what we call Burking. Have you heard of Burking?
Isn't it a dance when you bend forward?
I'm not sure, but we have two men, one by the name of William Burke and the other one by William Hare. And an unusual opportunity presented itself when a tenant of William Hare, who was an elderly armed pensioner by the name of Old Donald, who died of natural causes but owed £4 to William Hare for his thing. He died, but because of that owing, they thought, well, how are we going to recoup this? So what did they do? They then got his coffin, filled it with tanning bark, and then took his body to the local medical school at Edinburgh. And they paid £7 and 10 shillings. They made quite a profit. And so what happened then? A few months later, they found another tenant who was sick. But instead of waiting, Burke and Hare decided to go around there and expedite the death. And with some whiskey and after a few drinks, they restrained him and suffocated him, and then covered with the nose and the mouth, and then sold him to the medical school. This went on for quite some time, and by the end of what happened, they had at least killed 16 people to sell to medical schools.
Oh my God.
And this killing act became known for anatomical as Burking. And so medical schools and education found themselves in this weird black market that ended up causing this UK to pass the Anatomy Act in 1832, and then bodies could be acquired through this. So this was the weirdest story that I sort of could.
Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Burking. So Burking, he was William. They were both Williams. They could be Willing, though, wouldn't it?
That's the whole. The amazing thing. The extra little twist at the end is William Hare. They both got caught. William Hare ended up got immunity, testifying against William Burke, who then Burke was hung and
sold body to medical schools. Right, there you go.
That's the irony of that. What a twist.
All right, so that's my submission for the first one. We'll see how we go.
All right, very good. And I've got to work out which one's the most interesting. And I find it intriguing that you're both here to talk about medical education, and both of your stories revolve around death, particularly Tristan's with a naughty medical student being hanged, which we might need to use as an offence inside the recording of this podcast. And that's just mind-blowing what you came up with there, Travis. I'll just say, I think it's a bit of a tie. We might call it a dead rubber. All right, let's regroup and we'll come back in just a moment to move into the topic proper of medical education. Let's continue now with our investigation and reflection on medical education. And Dr. Tristan Rutland, having you here, I'd like to start, especially after your opening story, to look at you. Medicine. Is it something that you've always wanted to do or not?
Well, thank you, Steve. That's an interesting question because I think it's medicine, something I've always toyed around with from the get-go. I don't come from a medical family, but we lived in a small town. We had a small GP. We had a GP that looked after us all, and got on really well. And he was a very inspirational figure, and it's something that I sort of thought about. And when I was doing high school, it was something that I thought I wanted to do, but I really wanted to do a lot of things. I ended up going off and doing pharmacy because I was always told if you wanted to do medicine, you have to be passionate about it. So as a result, I went off and did pharmacy for 10 years. And then I realized, yes, this is so it took me a while to realize that it was something I wanted to do. So yeah, it's when I look back at it, yes, but I really just had to go through a lot of experience to actually crystallize that was my career path.
And as you were studying, did you then, and got into it, did you have a goal in mind? Was there some place you saw yourself being in years down the track?
It's one of these interesting things. I came from the country. I always thought that I'd love to be a country GP. I've got a huge amount of respect for country GPs. I think they do a lot of great work, and they have a lot of barriers and hardships they have to do, with the distance. So I always thought that. But I think medicine is, and I say this to the students, you need to see what is. There's a smorgasbord of specialties out there, and you need to taste them all, quite frankly, to see what it was. So for me, listen, I had a fantastic anatomical pathology lecture in first year, and that was really something that caught my eye, and I just grew into that as well. I always thought, and then I originally thought GP, then I thought physicians, and everyone thought I was going to do physicians, but no, pathology was something that just grew and grew and grew, and then and once again, I'm very happy that I did that.
Can I ask then, because it was so clearly that lecturer or the tutor was influential in your choice into pathology. Can I ask you, what was it about what they did or how they presented that caught your attention and got your interest?
Well, let me put it this way: he won Lecturer of the Year, unofficial Lecturer of the Year. He was just, and it was what I try and do now. He was very good at explaining complex things and integrating the basic sciences with the clinical. So things just clicked. His lectures were just very simple and basic, and he could just make you understand why it was important we were learning all this basic science. And then when you walked away from it, you actually realized, I actually have learned a lot of clinical stuff with that as well. It was just his manner. And don't get me wrong, I've come across lots of lectures like that, but particularly, and it got me interested in pathology, because there's a way that he could sort of talk about the disease states and, the histology and how it all sort of really was so important to the clinical. But then you sort of saying, but you remember back in your lecture that you did on biochemistry or anatomy, how this is this, or this translates this into, surgical staging, or when we give them, chemotherapy and stuff. And that was what really got me hooked.
Just looking then, because you are now an educator online, but as well as face-to-face through the university. How would you rate the state of sort of medical education and pathology today?
In Australia, that's a interesting and maybe a little bit of controversial question. I think it's patchy. I think there are some really good places around. I think some really good universities around good university teaching of pathology. Some points of light, I think, as well, that do it very well. I got involved with Western Sydney University because when I came here as a registrar, I got involved in the teaching program, and they had a good, solid pathology teaching program, and that's why I continued on here, because I really liked it. ANU, University of Western Australia, there's a bunch, and I'm sure I've missed out. There's a bunch of people, but I think there's some really good guys doing some work around there now. I think some other universities that maybe have not engaged as well, haven't got as with the pathology thing, and it's sort of gone a little bit away. Anatomy did about 10, 15 years ago, maybe even more longer than that, where anatomy at one point, some universities was an optional subject. Now, I don't think pathology's been relegated to that, but I certainly know the emphasis is not put on it in some universities now. And I think, unfortunately, it's a shame, because I think it really is the fundamental basis of medicine. And having that understanding just means you become a better practitioner because you understand, not only just because when the pathologist phones you up or you read the report, you understand what you do, but you can actually understand what's going on. So yeah, that's my opinion on it. I'm sure that other people have differing opinions, but I think there are good places around doing good things.
Just, have you got a theory as to why it can sometimes fall back in the pack a little bit within some of those institutions?
It's interesting. It's something that I've been kicking over a bit. I think it's a multitude of different things. I think, so unlike other specialties, pathology is very much seen very basic science heavy in the first few years. Okay, so there's a lot of emphasis on basic science, certainly in the university I work in. But the good thing is, because I'm getting integrated, I'm expanding out to the third and fourth years, and you become more visible. So the other clinical academics, the doctors that I work with that are involved in medical education, are surgeons and physicians, and they tend to have a higher load in the clinical setting. So when they're running around, so they're more visible and so on and so forth. So people, I think that maybe it's a bit more like a basic science. And as a result, maybe it just doesn't have as much emphasis as well. Why I think that pathology is great at covering all these different aspects I think because we're not visible as a profession and we are behind the scenes and we maybe are seen as a bit more reinforced at that basic science sort of level, I think that's just part of the problem. And I think it's just a bit of a perception of pathologists. I think the pandemic maybe has done a bit for certainly our colleagues that work in micro and their wonderful work, and the general pathologists, of course, as well, that raising the status of pathology. I actually notice sometimes that people will thank the doctors and pathologists, and I'm thinking doctors are pathologists. But I think it's just part of that sort of, I think it really is just essentially just being visible, a bit more visible. And if you're more visible, you get more integrated into it as well. That's my theory.
Yeah. So do you think being more visible is probably the way to encourage more students and doctors into pathology? Is there a, I mean, there's not really a magic bullet, so to speak, in this area, but I do notice a lot of educators talk about, oh, how do we get more people into this field? Do you see that as something, as a necessity, or do you? Yeah.
I think so. From my experiences, I had mentioned I had a really good pathologist that taught us, and that got me into it as well. I also just think giving good quality teaching at all levels. So what I try and do now is, we have a heavy basic science load, but I do 3rd and 4th year sort of teaching as well, and 5th year. And so to show that we are clinicians, and I actually try and do it with the surgeons and the oncologists and be involved in that. So that basically makes it much more visible. And because I've done that in the first few years, I've actually had more students asking to come to the lab now and spend some time here. And that's really good, because if you get students interested in coming to see the lab, then they're interested. So if you say and I make sure I get up there, and when I'm lecturing, I say, listen, I'm a clinician. The academics who will teach you all this fantastic basic science stuff you really, really need to know. My job is to integrate that together. I am a clinician. I work in a hospital. I'm a doctor. I keep on reinforcing that. I get my registrars to do some pracs. I make sure they reinforce, they talk about the clinical. So just really reinforcing that we are clinicians, and the students start to pick up that is now a viable option of a profession that they want to do. Now, not everyone's going to want to be a pathologist, but there are going to be a smaller group of people there that might not have seen that or thought about it, that might actually do it, like myself as well.
Who knows? Maybe this whole experience with COVID might have a silver lining by raising the perception and the appreciation of that line of defence or offence, which is pathology. And of course, for raising visibility, I mean, Dr. Travis Brown wears rather garish cardigans around. Maybe that's one of the keys. Let's come back, because I want to look at the path ahead in more detail, because there are lots of aspects of this which we'll get into from within the medical fraternity, but also out there on social media as well. Let's continue now with This Medical Life. Dr. Tristan Rutland is with us from Sydney. Dr. Travis Brown, let's get to this most important part.
So looking at the basis of medical education, even throughout the ages, for the last few thousand years, the predominant teaching method has actually been an apprenticeship. Mm-hmm. It's been not necessarily studying textbooks and doing exams. It has actually been going in, learning, with other doctors, and, sometimes that was good and sometimes that was bad.
It's the equivalent of our social media experts in medical world as well, because they watch a video on YouTube and they sort of pick it up along the way.
Well, it's a way to learn. You do one. What's that one? You see one, you do one, you teach one. That's the kind of model. But we've been now doing the medical education for a few hundred years. It's a university style didactic teaching. Here's the information, go away, learn, and then sort of drift into the sort of hospital system. Just bringing Tristan in and just asking, because he's an educator, do you think this is the right model? Do you think this is the right path, and we're just going along as we are?
I think that's a great question. I think so. Thinking about, I've had this discussion numerous times with a lot of my colleagues about medical education in regards to what's the best way of doing it. Yeah, it is an apprenticeship, and I think there's no way really about it as well. Is that once again, you've got the difference between a junior new staff specialist and a senior staff specialist's experience and dealing with those grey areas of, I don't really know what to do with things. And that's something that unfortunately cannot be taught at a university level. That's purely on the job sort of type teaching as well. That said, you do need to have that fundamental basis. And I think the university for providing that sort of solid, fantastic sort of clinical education of the medical science is really, really important as well. I think it has been moving away from, it hasn't been moving away from the university system, certainly in this country, but the university system has been doing it in a different way, certainly with the introduction of PBLs. Now, PBLs are designed, it's funny, and I think when I look back at my PBL, so problem-based learning, so essentially, where you get a problem, you work around it, you learn everything around that problem. When you look about that as a consultant, you actually say, that's a really good model to learn more. And I'm sure you've come across this, Travis, is that you find something you haven't come across beforehand, like, some weird tumor or a weird condition that you haven't come across, but you read around it and you learn all this sort of stuff. And then at the end of the, even if you send off for a second opinion, and it comes back and you've learned all this stuff, not just about the tumor, but the differential, the different, all these different stains and all that sort of other techniques and all that sort of stuff. And essentially PBLs, I feel that's what they are in some ways. So I think in some ways it is changing a bit. Now it's interesting in the US, I've done a talk over there recently, and they have the university system and the medical schools all sort of mixed up together in the hospital university system, which is quite an interesting sort of thing. And I think that's not a bad thing. So yeah, I think that the university supplying that really good fundamental basic sort of stuff is fantastic, but more integration into the hospital for that sort of ongoing apprenticeship thing, I think is really important. If I had my time again, actually I had a pretty good run, but I spent a lot of time out in the wards seeing stuff, and it really helped me cement all that stuff that I learned at medical school.
Well, the interesting thing about PBLs, because I went through that model as well, is it probably wasn't explained that they're teaching a methodology, not necessarily a condition. Because you end up, each week you learn a different problem. Well, the end of a term, you've learned, 12 or 13 conditions. But you sit there and just go, oh, well, I've only learned 12 or 13. And I don't think people emphasize, no, you're actually learning a strategy on how to learn, because there are thousands of diagnoses out there. And I think what sort of probably I didn't realize was that the methodology was the important part, because there is literally thousands of things that can't be taught because you just don't have the time. So I think PBLs sort of are a really good methodology, but it needs to be said, we're teaching you a methodology as opposed to a disease.
Yeah, and I think you've hit the nail exactly on the head there as well. I think that's absolutely correct. And one of the things I think it is difficult, and maybe is I feel sorry for some of the academics that have to teach PBLs with not knowing that fundamental basis, because they've been thrown into it as well. Because now I know this. If I do a PBL, if I do a PBL, I know I can say this to the students: hey guys, this is what I do on a day-to-day basis when I don't come across stuff, and it makes them it engages them more as well. So I think you're right. I think telling the students from the get-go, you learn this because this is what you're going to be doing when you're out there. And some students will say, that's great, take it on and it'll make a difference. And some will just continue to carry on as 18-year-old frontal lobe driven children.
Now, in most fields of medicine, research is just expanding our knowledge horizons every day. It grows. It's exponential. In my world, there's a writer in the world of marketing, Seth Godin, who runs courses to teach people business. And he says, just having a domain of knowledge is no longer something, because we've got the internet, we've got resources. There's no value in that. It's the value of understanding how to find the right stuff and how to apply it. What are some of the, tips for managing this for educators and students in this bombardment of new information that's changing all the time and growing?
Well, that's a fantastic question. So I can answer part of that question and also sort of reflect back what you just said. When I was doing my pharmacy training, in my final few weeks before I became a pharmacist, somebody said this sage bit of knowledge, and they said, a good pharmacist doesn't need to know everything. They just need to know when and where to look it up in. And I think that applies to everything. I think, and if you have that idea, that's great. Now, the point is you need to know enough that you don't know enough. That's the point as well. And I say that the pathology registrars when they're starting in their first year. You guys don't know what you don't know. So, that's the point. Now, to answer your question, I still think that paying attention in medical school and listening to the academics talk about that basic medical stuff is the best thing you can do. Because if you have a solid foundation of basic stuff, when something doesn't make sense because it's a weird and wonderful thing that you've never come across, you'll know that that's like, I don't know what this is, but I know that it's not normal. I'll go and sort it out. So I say, know the basics, know what normal is, and then you apply a bit of common sense. And that's how you deal with this exponential information. And then having the ability to know, okay, so if I don't know this is a good resource to look at. This is a good resource. I can go and ask someone, have some sort of developing strategies to deal with this. And it is that grey area I talked about as well. And part of that grey area is just not knowing stuff. So I think that's part of it. And I think it's really important you learn that from the get-go in medical school, and for everything else, I think, but particularly in medical school. Because you're right, it is exploding everywhere. And even in like subspecialty pathology, you're never going to know everything in one particular thing.
Yeah. Now, one avenue you use is Twitter. You're very active on Twitter. You're put on amazing tweetorials, as they call it. What got you interested in this as an avenue of education?
Oh, well, 2 words, Amanda Ireland. Well, she is now a consultant, actually, as well, from Western Australia, but she's a registrar. And I taught her last year during the pandemic. I taught all most of the RCPA registrars. And she just suggested, you should get into Twitter. It's involved in it. It's a great place to learn. And she urged me to do it. And then another one of my colleagues here, Dr. Zaid Hussein, he was in it. He said, no, you should do it. So I basically dipped my toes in it, in the water, and loved it and just dived in. And that was it for me. It was something that I wish I'd had when I was a registrar myself. In fact, which I'd had as a medical student. Yeah, it was essentially word of mouth, funnily enough.
Because for those people listening, so there's a hashtag Path Twitter, which is probably the most welcoming community of pathologists, I can say. Yeah, look, it's incredible. It's sort of probably the antithesis of what you think Twitter is.
It's funny you say that, because I give it. So one of my talks that I give is just talking about social media and pathology and medical education, but pathology in particular. And I always start off with saying I don't like social media because of that whole, I didn't like it before I did PAF Twitter in inverted commas. So one of the best bits on Twitter, and I'm sure you might have seen this, Travis, is there's that Dr. Glaucoma Effect now. He's an ophthalmologist, does all these funny videos. And he wrote this post saying, whenever life on Twitter gets me down, I always go to PAF Twitter and see all the amazing stuff the pathologists are getting super excited about. And then someone put this meme up, and it's this picture of this volcano in Iceland exploding, and there's lava going everywhere. And in the foreground, there's just these guys playing ball, having a fun time. And the caption is, the volcano is Twitter. And then there's pathologists, and it's just pretty much what it is. The rest of the world can burn. Pathologists are just doing their own thing, getting on with everyone, and actually making a bit of a difference. So, yeah.
Well, the blessing and the curse of social media is that everyone has a voice and they're connected. And the curse aspect is that does lead into little echo chambers where some people, not talking about pathologists necessarily here, but the people who will read your stuff who aren't, because you don't have private rooms in Twitter. It's all out there. Do you have much intersection with people who, if we look at the Dunning-Kruger effect, are right at the beginning where they have no idea how little they know and they think they know everything, gate crashing in with conspiracy theories and ignorant questions and causing turbulence in your sharing of knowledge on Twitter?
That's a funny question. I've been asked that a couple of times now, and the answer is honestly no. I'm surprised. I really thought that I would have had more of it. And I'm serious. I suppose maybe because mine is very dry, sort of, it's very specialized, and it's obviously completely, it's just like I try to keep it as without personal opinions as much as well. So no, I haven't actually. And that's one thing I do say. And also, I think there's unwritten rules on PAF Twitter that you don't try and say anything that will start to get people's ire up. Funnily enough, I don't see people say any political comments at all, which is really great. Like, regardless of, so it's almost like the community itself. Yeah, you're right. It's not a walled off community. People can look at this as well. And you do get patients following us, and that's something to be encouraged in some ways, because educating patients is a really important thing. And there's been papers on pathologists being involved in patients on social media by Jared Gardner that just show that's really, really beneficial. But no, it's interesting. I haven't had anyone I haven't had a lay person saying, no, that's not that type of cancer.
Mm.
All right, challenge accepted.
So I have encountered this, and I'm sure you have, and I imagine you were hesitant about getting on Twitter, and maybe initially, I certainly was. Is this something, would you encourage more doctors and more pathologists to get onto social media?
Yeah, and I think it plays into that whole perception of what social media is about in the media, so to speak, that it is a bit of a, bun fight between people and their different opinions as well. And that said, I can also understand why people might be hesitant because they don't understand what you can, what you can't do, and so on and so forth. Yes, of course, I think I would encourage people. I spoke to Australian New Zealand Sarcoma Association a couple of weeks ago, and once again, there was patients there. And just talking about what the wealth of information that is out there, benefits that can be out there as well, and trying to tell people that, yeah, I know you can be hesitant about getting involved in this, but you can actually make a really big difference. The other thing about it is I think there's always a bit of a concern about, confidentiality and all that sort of stuff as well. And I think that's sort of something that people get really quite concerned about. But if it's done correctly, where the principle is don't do any harm, but tweet the entity, don't tweet the patient. I don't put no clinical information up. Any identifying things in my case is usually pretty old. But on the flip side, the actual benefits to the patients indirectly by people learning and picking up maybe tumours from people putting stuff up are just massive. I know, for example, we've diagnosed things here that we've seen from someone in the US or somewhere else has put up an interesting case as well. So, yeah.
All right. Well, look, thank you very much, Tristan. That will take us to sort of the end of, us burning you with questions. Do you have time for one last story, either yourself or myself?
Funnily enough, the story I was going to say sort of rolled into pretty much what you were talking about as well. I was literally going to be talking about just Salerno Medical School and the bodies of executed criminals.
Yeah, that's all good.
But it was like, I think your one was more sort of just amusing about that as well. There's plenty of other medical stories and stuff. But I think it sort of overlaps very much a bit with yours as well. Mine was sort of coming from the beginning of where you came from, where they were looking at like execute. It's quite funny. We're all talking about death, aren't we?
My next one's not about death if you have time. So
I would love to hear your one as well, because I said there's a bit of overlap, but I particularly enjoyed your. It was a fantastic story. So, yeah, go for it.
I will just say, though, with both of you harking back to the body stealing for science and using the bodies of criminals, if only Charles Dickens had written a novel in which the little kid's asking their dad, why do you keep doing crime, Dad? Well, one day I want to help further medical science, my lad.
Yeah, so just the establishment of I thought it was fantastic. This is medical school in Italy. Have you...
No, I don't know it. So it sounds like it'll be a good story.
It's been something that was closed down in the 1800s, but it's almost like a bit of a mythological school in some ways. So there was a story about how it was established and how a Greek traveler, I think he had a wound in his leg and he was sort of sat by a rock or something. And anyway, a couple of other people turned up to try and help him out. It was another Greek. I think it might have been a Jew and an Arab came at the same time, and this is about the 1900s, where I know it's not going like that.
Sounds like a joke, yes.
No, but I know it does. It's a horrible joke. But in actual fact, when we talk back there, remember the Arabs in particular, and obviously Jews were very fluid throughout Europe as well. The Arabs in particular they had taken on a lot of that Greek and Roman sort of knowledge and would really furthered medical education. A lot of the medical education that came back to Europe after the Dark Ages came from the interaction with the Arabs, because they really refined a lot of it. And a pity I couldn't tell you the story about Sancho the Fat. That's a fantastic story. It's not a medical education story, though. That's one of my favorite stories. Anyway, so the point was they basically put their minds together and cured this guy's leg. So that's the whole point. And then they established this medical school on there in that case as well. So, which I thought was just an interesting little anecdote about it. So the story was essentially that, so then about the 1200s that they decided that about that sort of time, it's like, oh, well, how do we do autopsies? Well, they decided, one of the kings decided, rightio, well, you guys can have a batch of like executed criminals every 2 or 3 years. So to basically deliver all these executed criminals. And I just couldn't imagine being a medical student, saying, all right, well, we're doing autopsies on a 2-year cycle. So here comes the cart, all these executed. And I was just like, how would you logistically do this? It's a very odd sort of stuff. So it was more a sort of a musing of, if you're a medical student and, I don't know how you've got a 6 or 7 year course, you get to do, 3 types of autopsies, but it's every 2 years and it's sort of like a bit of a festival, really, isn't it? Every 2 years, this batch of educators, anyway,
the practicality of that is a little bit interesting, because I'd think there and go, well, the state of the bodies would be all different because they all wouldn't be fresh.
That's exactly right. And I was just thinking, do you store them up, or do they have a big sort of like, okay, you guys are all being executed, then we're going to ship you to the medical school? It's like like the bit of, the last bit of Pirates of the Caribbean or something, where they're just hanging people by, I don't know. Anyway, It does make the mind boggle.
Well, that was charming. Dr. Travis Brown.
All right, so I'll be quick. But this is a story about John Hunter. Now, we are in the 18th century again. Mm-hmm. So he's a Scottish-born surgeon, scientist and educator. He taught over, 1,000, students and lecturers. Now, he was well aware of the placebo effect because he was an experimenter himself. Now, he urged students to question accepted practices. He formulated new hypotheses. He was a very big fan of, test, observe, experiment,
execute.
But he had a particular interest in venereal disease and sexually transmitted infections. Now, this was not known well at the time. It was not understood well at the time. And even to tie in, again, we keep on coming back to these dead bodies. He was a customer of the resurrectionists.
Right.
And he ended up, he had 2 entrances to his house. One was the regular and the other one was for dead bodies to come on in and he could dissect. Even he got the person by the name of Charles Burns, who was on the London Circus, who was over 8 foot tall. Now, what happened with him was he realized that he was going to be, dug up because he was such an odd specimen, so to speak. And he actually set to, before he died, was going to institute, I'm going to be buried at sea. Well, he wasn't. And somehow his coffin got full of rocks and ended up in John Hunter's museum, this 8 foot skeleton type thing, who he paid £500 to get, which is just incredible. But he was open to his students about admitting your mistakes and knowing what those mistakes were. Someone even challenged him one time, said, you had a different opinion last year. And his, retort was, well, very likely I did. I hope I keep learning every year. So he was even a teacher of Edward Jenner, who did the smallpox experiments that we got the current version of vaccinations, and previously. But it's really interesting because, again, in May of 1767, he did a self-experiment and he published this, and it's called A Treatise on Venereal Disease. And so this experiment, he used a lancet and got the pus from a patient who had gonorrhea, and he inoculated his own penis. And what happened? So this patient had gonorrhea. So the problem was he developed a chancre, an ulcer, and then he got groin lymphadenopathy. Later, he developed symmetrical rash on his leg, and he got tonsillar abscesses, and he got painful joints, which he treated himself with mercury, which was the treatment at the time. But the problem was the patient didn't just have gonorrhea.
Oh, no.
He had given himself syphilis.
Syphilis.
And so the amazing thing was, from that experiment, he conflated the two and thought that gonorrhea and syphilis was the same disease. And so for the next 50 years, that was what it was thought, until it was proven otherwise by a French physician by the name of Philippe Ricord, who then was able to disprove. So that was a self-experiment where it just boggles the mind. Yes, are you okay, Steve?
He didn't see that coming?
It's just, what? Wow. you know, you're winning the Nobel Prize for swallowing some Helicobacter, but that's the next level.
Well, the problem is maybe if he had got the conclusion right, he would have got the Nobel Prize at that. Well, no, it wasn't until 1901 when it was instituted, but maybe he should have got it. But
yeah, maybe he was stiffed by missing out from that. Thank you very much, Dr. Tristan Rutland, for joining this relatively straightforward episode of This Medical Life, and I hope people have found it interesting, and not just GPs but also students, medical students who might have wandered onto this episode and got some of your insights.
Thank you very much for having me.
And Dr. Travis Brown, thank you as always. I'll now uncross my legs. This Medical Life is recorded in the Talked About Marketing Studios in Adelaide. For show notes and more information about the podcast, visit thismedicallife.com.au. You can contact the hosts via Twitter. Dr. Travis Brown is at Dr. Travis Brown. That's DR for doctor. And Steve Davis is at Steve Davis. Editing and production is by Tim Whiffen. Design is by Tom Buzenjut. This has been a Pathnotes Proprietary Limited production.
Life is uncertain. It's okay to feel stressed, anxious, worried, or frustrated. It's normal. With CalHope's free and secure mental health resources, it's easy to get the help you and your loved ones need when you need it the most. Call our warm line at 833-317-4673 or live chat at calhope.org today.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.